When discussing the Great Depression, historians often focus on unemployment statistics, bank failures, stock market losses, and government programs. Yet one of the most revealing indicators of how Americans coped with economic catastrophe can be found in a much less obvious place: the movie theater. The paradox is striking. At the very moment millions of Americans were experiencing the worst economic crisis in the nation's history, Hollywood was producing some of its most beloved stars, and among the most popular of them was Janet Gaynor. To understand why Janet Gaynor became such an important figure during the Depression, we must first understand the world in which her audience lived. The Great Depression officially began with the stock market crash of October 1929, but its effects reached far beyond Wall Street. Between 1929 and 1933, the American economy contracted by nearly one-third. Thousands of banks failed. Industrial production collapsed. By the spring of 1933, unemployment reached approximately 25%. For many Americans, this was not merely an economic downer. It was a social and psychological crisis. Workers who had spent decades believing in the promise of upward mobility suddenly found themselves unemployed. Families lost farms that had been in their possession for generations. White-collar professionals joined breadlines. Young people entered adulthood facing a labor market that had effectively disappeared. The Depression did more than reduce incomes. It undermined confidence in the future. And it was precisely during this period that movie attendance remained remarkably resilient. Although attendance declined from the extraordinary heights of the late 1920s, Americans still purchased tens of millions of movie tickets every week throughout much of the Depression. Economists and cultural historians have long viewed this as evidence that entertainment fulfilled an essential social function during times of crisis. Movies provided what scholars sometimes call compensatory consumption. When people lose access to material prosperity, they often seek psychological compensation through experiences that provide emotional satisfaction, fantasy, aspiration, or temporary relief. For Depression audiences, the movie theater became one of the most affordable forms of psychological escape available. For the price of a ticket, audiences received several hours in a heated or air-conditioned environment, surrounded by music, laughter, romance, adventure, and images of a world far removed from their own hardships. This context helps explain the extraordinary popularity of Janet Gaynor. By the early 1930s, Gaynor was among the most successful actresses in America. She had already made history by becoming the first recipient of the Academy Award for Best Actress. More importantly, she had become one of the most bankable stars in the industry. In 1931 and 1932, trade publications consistently ranked her among the nation's leading box office attractions. Yet Janet Gaynor represented a different kind of stardom than many of her contemporaries. To appreciate this distinction, it is useful to compare her with other major female stars of the era. Greta Garbo embodied mystery and sophistication. Marlene Dietrich projected cosmopolitan glamour and sexual confidence. Joan Crawford represented ambition and modernity. Norma Shearer often portrayed affluent, sophisticated women navigating elite social worlds. Janet Gaynor occupied a different cultural space. Film historian Janine Basinger has noted that Gaynor's appeal rested heavily on her emotional accessibility. Her characters frequently embodied resilience, sincerity, vulnerability, and optimism. Rather than appearing larger than life, she often appeared recognizably human. This distinction mattered. Depression audiences were not simply looking for wealth and glamour. They were looking for emotional reassurance. Gaynor's screen persona suggested that ordinary people could endure hardship without losing their essential humanity. That message resonated profoundly during a decade when many Americans felt powerless. Films such as Sunny Side Up, State Fair, and later A Star is Born presented versions of perseverance that aligned closely with Depression-era values. Even when circumstances appeared difficult, Gaynor's characters tended to maintain dignity, kindness, and hope. These qualities mirrored the ideals many Americans wanted to see in themselves. Yet there was a deeper irony beneath this connection. The woman symbolizing perseverance and ordinary virtue was, in reality, a member of one of the wealthiest professions in America. While unemployment reached catastrophic levels, major Hollywood stars continued earning salaries that placed them among the economic elite. This disparity was enormous. A factory worker fortunate enough to remain employed might earn between $1,000 and $1,500 annually. Many families survived on even less. Some survived on nothing at all. Meanwhile, major film stars could earn thousands of dollars per week. Not per year, per week. Janet Gaynor herself commanded salaries that would have appeared unimaginable to many members of her audience. This raises an important historical question. Why did Depression audiences embrace wealthy movie stars rather than reject them? The answer reveals something important about the cultural role of celebrity. Unlike bankers, industrialists, or stock speculators, movie stars were generally not blamed for the economic collapse. In fact, many audiences viewed them as symbols of achievement rather than symbols of exploitation. Hollywood presented wealth as beautiful, glamorous, and aspirational. Fan magazines regularly published photographs of stars' homes, wardrobes, vacations, and lifestyles. Instead of generating resentment, these images often generated fascination. For audiences facing economic deprivation, celebrity lifestyles offered evidence that abundance still existed somewhere. The stars became living embodiments of dreams that the Depression had temporarily suspended. Janet Gaynor occupied a particularly interesting position within this system. Although she enjoyed substantial wealth, her public image never emphasized luxury to the same extent as some of her contemporaries. Her appeal remained grounded in relatability. Audiences saw a successful star who still seemed emotionally recognizable. This allowed her to bridge two worlds. She belonged economically to Hollywood's elite, yet culturally she remained connected to ordinary Americans. That combination proved extraordinarily valuable during a period of national crisis. Another factor often overlooked is the role of sound cinema. The Depression coincided almost exactly with Hollywood's transition from silent films to talking pictures. This technological revolution transformed the movie-going experience. Audiences no longer simply watched actors. They heard them. Voices created a new sense of intimacy. Stars became more human, more immediate, and more emotionally accessible. Janet Gaynor successfully navigated this transition. Her naturalistic style, which had already distinguished her during the silent era, adapted well to sound films. As a result, she remained relevant at a time when many silent-era performers disappeared from public favor. Her continued success reflected both her talent and her ability to embody qualities audiences found reassuring. There is also a broader economic dimension to Janet Gaynor's story. Hollywood itself became one of the few industries capable of selling optimism during the Depression. While factories produced fewer automobiles and consumers bought fewer household goods, movie studios continued producing narratives of romance, success, adventure, and redemption. In effect, Hollywood's primary product was not film. Its primary product was hope. This does not mean audiences were naive. Depression moviegoers understood perfectly well that Hollywood was selling fantasy. Many knew they would never live in mansions or attend glamorous parties. Yet they purchased tickets anyway. The fantasy itself possessed value. Cultural historians frequently compare moviegoing during the Depression to a form of collective emotional therapy. Audiences entered theaters burdened by economic anxiety and emerged, at least temporarily, relieved. The movies did not solve unemployment. They did not reopen banks. They did not restore lost savings. What they provided was psychological resilience. And resilience has economic value. People who maintain hope are more likely to endure hardship, seek opportunities, and preserve social stability. From this perspective, stars such as Janet Gaynor served a function extending far beyond entertainment. They became symbolic figures within a national effort to sustain morale, not through politics, not through policy, but through storytelling. By the end of the decade, the nation would begin shifting its attention toward new concerns, including the growing threat of global war. The worst years of the Depression would gradually recede into memory. Yet the legacy of performers like Janet Gaynor remained significant. They demonstrated that popular culture is not merely a reflection of society. It can also be a mechanism through which society copes with crisis. Janet Gaynor's popularity was therefore not an accident of celebrity. It was a product of a specific historical moment. Americans facing unemployment, uncertainty, and despair found comfort in a performer whose screen presence communicated optimism without arrogance, vulnerability without weakness, and hope without sentimentality. The irony remains fascinating. A wealthy Hollywood star became a source of emotional support for audiences who often struggled to afford the price of admission. Yet that irony helps explain why the movies mattered so much during the Great Depression. People were not simply buying entertainment. They were buying relief from anxiety. They were buying temporary refuge from economic reality. And in the face of one of the darkest chapters in American history, Janet Gaynor became one of the most recognizable faces of that refuge. But that is only the surface of the story. Because if you look deeper, what the cinema provided in the 1930s was not just escape, but structure. It gave shape to emotions that real life refused to organize. In a world where jobs disappeared without warning and stability could vanish overnight, the movies still followed rules. Stories still had beginnings, middles, and endings. Conflicts still made sense. And most importantly, problems still resolved themselves. That sense of order mattered more than we often admit today. Economic historians sometimes point out that during the worst years of the Depression, discretionary spending collapsed across nearly every category except one. Cinema attendance remained comparatively resilient. Even when families had to choose between essentials, many still found a way to afford a movie ticket. Not because they were careless with money, but because the emotional return on that small expense was disproportionately high. A single ticket did not just buy a film. It bought 2 hours where uncertainty was replaced by narrative certainty. And that is where stars like Janet Gaynor become more than performers. They become emotional anchors. Gaynor's screen presence, often marked by sincerity and emotional clarity, offered audiences something that real life had stripped away. Her characters tended to endure hardship without cynicism. They were not untouched by suffering, but they were not destroyed by it either. That balance was crucial. Too much fantasy would feel fake. Too much realism would feel unbearable. Gaynor existed in the narrow emotional space in between. At the same time, the contrast between screen life and real life became sharper with every passing year of the Depression. Outside the theater, breadlines stretched longer. Farm foreclosures increased. Urban unemployment deepened. Yet inside the theater, people were watching love stories, musical numbers, and neatly resolved struggles. This contrast did not create denial. It created contrast therapy, a psychological relief effect driven by difference. And that is why Hollywood did not collapse during the Depression. It adapted. Studios learned quickly that audiences did not want to be reminded of their situation in unfiltered form. They wanted transformation. They wanted problems that looked like theirs, but ended in ways theirs currently did not. Janet Gaynor's films often reflected this sensibility. Even when characters suffered rejection or loss, the emotional tone rarely lingered in despair. There was always a forward motion toward resolution. That narrative rhythm mirrored what audiences hoped their own lives might eventually follow. There is also a larger industrial truth behind this period. Hollywood in the early 1930s was one of the few mass industries producing optimism at scale. Manufacturing was shrinking. Construction had slowed dramatically. Financial institutions were in crisis. But film studios were still producing thousands of reels of finished narrative product each year. In purely economic terms, Hollywood was exporting emotional experiences at a time when most industries were contracting. And audiences consumed those experiences not passively, but deliberately. They understood what they were doing. Many Depression-era viewers wrote in letters, diaries, and newspaper columns about the importance of cinema as a break from hardship. Not an illusion of escape, but a scheduled interruption in suffering. Something to endure life until life improved. That distinction matters, because it reframes the movies not as fantasy machines, but as survival tools. Even the stars themselves were not entirely separate from this reality. While Janet Gaynor lived in a world of financial security compared to her audience, she was also part of a studio system that could be unstable and controlling. Contracts were rigid. Creative control was limited. Careers could shift quickly depending on audience taste and studio politics. Stardom looked permanent from the outside, but internally, it was fragile. So in a strange way, both star and audience were living under different versions of instability. One economic, one professional. The difference was scale, not structure. And yet, despite that imbalance, the emotional transaction remained consistent. Audiences gave money. Studios gave stories. Stars like Gaynor gave faces to those stories. And for a few hours at a time, That exchange held the weight of something larger than commerce. It held emotional continuity in a world that had lost it. By the mid to late 1930s, as New Deal programs began stabilizing parts of the economy and as employment slowly recovered, the intensity of Depression-era despair began to ease. But the cultural habits formed during those years did not disappear. Moviegoing remained central to American life. The idea that cinema was not just entertainment, but emotional necessity, had already been established. Janet Gaynor's peak years were part of that foundation. Her legacy, viewed through the lens of the Depression, is not only that she was a popular star. It is that she existed at a moment when popularity itself carried psychological weight. When fame was not just recognition, but reassurance. Because in those years, people did not just want to see stories. They wanted to believe that stories still worked. And every time Janet Gaynor appeared on screen, she helped reinforce that belief, quietly and consistently, without needing to announce it. Not by solving the Depression, but by making it survivable from one dark week to the next.